want to say welcome and thank you so much for joining us for this Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month and Pride 2023 lecture. My name is Melissa Bautista and I serve as the Assistant Director for the Multicultural Resource Center Office of Diversity and Outreach, also known as the MRC. And before we begin, the MRC wanted to take some time to give gratitude to our sponsors and our collaborators. But before we do that, I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to take a moment to ground us in this virtual event in a land acknowledgement. This land acknowledgement was led by Dr. Tassi Bongiovanni, the Native American Health Alliance, an association of Native American medical students in collaboration with Ramaytush Ohlone elders. And some history around the UC system is the UC system is part of the Public Land Grant University that has and continues to benefit from the dispossession of Native land that the Morrill Act of 1862 funded to create the University of California and the 10 campuses in which UCSF is part of. It is important to name that at UCSF, we are guests, and we would like to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone people who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ohlone elders, past, present, and future who call this place, the land that UCSF sits upon, their home. We are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community, and we thank the Ramaytush Ohlone community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. So a large part of land acknowledgements isn't only to open our events or include them into our marketing, but it's really to think about how we can take action and be in solidarity with Indigenous and Native folks and communities locally, but also globally. Next slide, please. So if you go on the website, you can figure out how to get, or you can reflect on how you can get involved. A lot of that is just starting around educating or re-educating ourselves about Indigenous history and really challenging colonial narratives that are not only in the US, but again, globally. And if you are in a place that you can financially support, you can also think about how you can support some rematriation land efforts that are being led by our communities here in the Bay Area. And of course, this event would not be possible without our collaborators and our sponsors. So we would like to take this opportunity just to give gratitude to the graduate division, specifically Department of Cell and Tissue Biology, Biomedical Sciences, Biophysics program, the Office of Community and Government Relations, and the 3 Asian American centered staff registered campus organizations and ODO diversity committees, along with the LGBT committee, and then the resource centers, which are part of the Office of Diversity and Outreach. So part of this webinar, we are going to be having a Q&A after. So just highly recommend folks, if you're interested, that will be from 1 to 1:30 in a separate Zoom meeting. And that will be moderated by Adrian Esquera, who's the co-chair of the United Philippine X Association. And you can go ahead and register on this link, and then I'll go ahead and put that in the chat. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and invite Catherine Tan, who is a doctoral student, part of the graduate division here at UCSF, to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. As Melissa said, I'm Catherine. I'm a student at UCSF. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kevin Leo Yabut Nadal, who is a distinguished professor of psychology at the City University of New York. He's one of the leading researchers in understanding the impacts of subtle forms of discrimination, otherwise known as microaggressions, on the mental and physical health of people of color, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people, and other marginalized groups. Dr. Nadal has published over 100 works on multicultural issues in the fields of psychology and education, and he is the author of 14 books, including Filipino American Psychology, Microaggressions and Traumatic Stress, and Queering Law and Order. Dr. Nadal was the first and openly gay president of the Asian American Psychology Association in its 50-year history, and the first person of color to serve as the executive director of the Center for LGBTQ Studies in its 25-year history. He is the current president of the Filipino American National Historical Society, the youngest and first to openly identify as LGBTQ+. He co-founded the LGBTQ+ Scholars of Color National Network, the AAPA Division of Filipinx Americans, and the AAPA Division on LGBTQ+. Dr. Nadal has delivered hundreds of lectures across the United States, including the White House and the US Capitol. He has won numerous awards, including the American Psychology Association 2017 Early Career Award for Distinguished Contributions to Psychology in the Public Interest, the 2019 Richard Tewksbury Award from the Western Society of Criminology, the 2019 Thought Leadership Award from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the 2022 Teachers College Medal for Distinguished Service. So please welcome Dr. Nadal.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you to everyone who's been part of this event and coordinating this event. I'm really excited to be here. It's really a rare occasion where somebody asked me to speak about my intersectionalities, and what perfect time to do so as we celebrate the closing of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month last month, and now that we're in the month of June, which we all know is LGBTQ+ Pride Month. And so I'm happy to speak about that intersection of AAPI and LGBTQ experiences, integrate a little bit about history, as well as some of my own work with LGBTQ+ Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to share space with you all, be in community with you all, and hopefully help you all to engage in some things that many of us think about often, but others may not, because they may be unfamiliar with some of the things that may occur for people who identify at this intersection. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and you all can follow along. All right, I just always like acknowledging that whenever I do a webinar, I'm just talking to myself. So, I want to feel you nodding your head in spirit, and smiling and, snapping your fingers. Even though I can't see you, I just want to know that you're there. But the title of my presentation is Celebrating AAPI and LGBT Resilience, the intersection of AAPI heritage and LGBTQ+ pride. Feel free to tweet along, screenshot, share on Instagram stories. I am a firm believer that it is our duty to share knowledge, especially when it might not be accessible to people. So feel free to share any of this presentation with others. I want to start off by acknowledging the people who come before me, who I refer to as the Manongs and the revolutionaries. Manong in Tagalog and Ilocano is a word that is meant to convey someone who's an older brother to you, and then Manang would be the feminine equivalent of that. And so I come before, or the people who come before me include the Filipino American civil rights leaders like Larry Itliong and Philip Vera Cruz, as well as the Filipino revolutionaries like Gabriela Silong and Jose Rizal and Andres Bonifacio. And also for me, the LGBTQ+ trailblazers, pioneers, revolutionaries, especially those who also are people of color. So folks like Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and Wei Wah. I currently am sitting on Lenape lands, and so I acknowledge that I'm just occupying space, and I thank Native peoples for allowing me to be in this space with them. And so I also want to acknowledge my personal trailblazers, people who have really blazed trails for me to be able to be where I am today. I think my parents, Leo and Charity Nadal, who were immigrants from the Philippines, came here at a time when there was still a quota on the number of Filipinos who could enter the United States, and at the time it was 100. I think my grandparents, Maria and Dioscoro Nadal, as well as Oliva and Rodolfo Yabot, who were raising their kids during World War II. My parents were 5 and 4 years old when Japanese bombs were flying through the air, and that's part of their history with trauma. And so I acknowledge that their ability to survive that violence is why I'm here today. I also acknowledge that my parents were among the few in their families to get educated and to migrate to the United States. And when they did so, that afforded me the opportunities to be able to become educated and to have all the privileges that I have today. My parents came initially in the 1960s, as I mentioned, before before the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, in which Asian people first were able to come to the United States without quotas. Prior to 1965, we know that there were exclusion acts, including the first Page Act of 1875, followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act, or the Asian Exclusion Acts of 1882, which prevented the number of Asian people from coming into our countries. Filipinos had a pass because in 1898 they were colonized by the United States, which allowed some migration to the US. But because of anti-Asian sentiment, there was a quota. And from the first part of the century, the quota was 50 Filipinos per year. But for the 10 years prior to the Immigration Naturalization Act, that number increased to 100. So my mother first came here in 1962 as a nurse. She worked in Cook County Hospital in Chicago. And so it was really eye-opening for me when I realized that she would have been one of the few who were able to come that year. She went back to the Philippines, met my father, and she said that she wanted to come back to America because there were so many opportunities that she had there that she didn't have in her rural home of the Philippines. My father wasn't really interested in moving to the United States, but he loved my mother, and because my mother was the Beyonce of the Philippines at the time, he agreed to start all over. And so I share this part of my history for a couple of reasons. One, because I think it's so important for us to get to know the reasons why some of our ancestors and family members came to the US, to understand the circumstances, and as well as to understand some of the costs and the struggles and some of the stressors that they may have experienced at that time. When I think about my parents coming in the 1960s, I think about the notion that they may have never seen their families again, that they didn't have social media or even telephones that worked in the ways that they do now. And so there really was the chance or the possibility that they would never see their families again. Yet they made that sacrifice primarily so that their hypothetical children could have opportunities that they didn't have yet. I think about that often because I don't know that I would make so much sacrifice today to give up so much just for my children to have opportunities. And so I really am grateful for them today. The second piece why I share this is for us to recognize that Asian American history and American history in general continues to repeat itself in the same ways that Asian people had been limited in coming to the United States. There have been many attempts to limit other groups from coming to the United States. For example, in 2017, when Muslim majority countries were banned from coming to the US. And other points of history in which people have been discriminated against in very similar ways. When we think about the COVID pandemic and the anti-Asian sentiment that happened as a result of that, I also think about the Asian Exclusion Act and the anti-Asian sentiment that occurred back then. When we think about the violence that has occurred over the past 3 years as a result of people blaming Asian Americans for the COVID pandemic, I think about in the early 1900s in which Asian Americans were violently attacked because they were accused of bringing over disease or of being immoral or of changing the value of the United States. And so thinking about history is important for understanding the context of today. This is a photo of me and my family. I'm the youngest and obviously cutest. And my parents they came here to the US like I said, to provide us with opportunities. One of the things that I've learned most about being a child of immigrants is that we were the first of our generation to have to navigate two worlds from birth. And that means that we learned how to be Filipino in the home. We learned about our values, traditions, food, cultural aspects, dance, dress, etc. And then we also learned how just to be all American kids. In later years, I would learn that this would be called biculturalism, which is the notion of navigating two cultures at once. I'd also learn about things like code switching, which means being able to operate in certain spaces through the lens of one or more identities. And, to be a child, to be able to code switch from a very early age, definitely gave me a sense of resilience, but also introduced me to the world ahead of me, that there would be certain people that may be more accepting of me and my identities, and that there might be people that I would have to change for in order to be more accepted. And so these are some of the earlier lessons that I learned as a child. And when we think about today and how many people are trying to protect children from learning about race and gender and sexuality, I think about those of us who are forced to learn about race and gender and sexuality, especially when you're different, because even if they're not teaching those things in the school, the real world may teach us those lessons instead. These are some photos of me. I think on the left, I'm about 6 or 7 years old, and on the right, I'm 7 or 8 years old. I just like showing these photos because when I first came out as queer or gay to my family, my parents were like, we had no idea. And then I look at these photos, I'm like, really? You didn't have any idea? Look at this kid. He's so fierce. He has his hand on his hip already posing. I share these photos because I think some of these photos capture just who I was as a kid when I didn't have to worry about some of the negative messages, when I didn't have to worry about the bullying, when I didn't have to worry about the gender norms that were bestowed upon me in my later childhood and adolescence. I could just be me. And being a queer kid in a immigrant family, especially a religious immigrant family, led to another set of stressors, which is not wanting to disappoint my family, perhaps bringing shame to my family, especially because I didn't have any out LGBTQ folks in my family who were able to tell me that it was okay. And while I didn't experience some of the horrific types of violence that many LGBTQ people experience, such as being violently attacked by my peers or my family members, being kicked out of my home, I definitely internalized this notion that being queer was bad, that I had to hide who I was, and that perhaps if I hid it, that I could still make my family happy. And so that's something that I carried with me for a long time. And even though even then, we didn't have the messages that kids have now, we know that there are still many children, young people who still experience some of these things, that there's this shame of being queer or trans, that they try to hide it, and that their families may not be accepting. And so this is why it's so important for all of us to do our parts to ensure that young people realize that being queer or trans is actually a beautiful thing. I ended up going through a lot of therapy, learning to love myself. I ended up searching for community and people who shared my identities. And I mentioned the therapy piece because I think for a lot of people, it's hard to externalize some of the messages that we learned. How would I ever learn to love myself if I never knew it was okay to be queer or trans? How would I ever learn to find love and to receive love by others if I never had those people in my life to tell me that being queer was a beautiful thing? And so 40 years later, here I am. I got married 9 years ago. I now have 3 children with my husband, and I've come a long way. And I share this piece with you because not that this is the ideal, that everyone has to experience this in order to be happy. In fact, I don't think everyone even needs to be in a relationship or have children to be happy. But for me, it just shows how far I've come from that kid who really internalized being queer to this person who is now able to live a life of being out and happy and being proud of who I am. I every year during Pride Month, I reflect back to that kid who was bullied, that kid who thought daily about suicide, that kid who saw that there were pride parades going on and would go in the opposite direction because I was so ashamed, to now being a person who is at the forefront of a lot of these pride celebrations or LGBTQ organizations. And I hope that, my pure visibility and representation can hopefully even just let one kid know that it's okay, especially one queer Asian American or Filipino American kid know that not only is it okay to be queer or trans, but that it's something to be celebrated. So what are we talking about today? So we have a few things that we're going to talk about. I'm just going to put it all out here. One, I want to talk briefly about LGBTQ plus history. I want to talk about Asian American Pacific Islander history. I'll share a little bit about LGBTQ API history. We'll talk about some of the current issues affecting LGBTQI APIs. And then I want to talk about this notion of being accomplices and upstanders for those who are here in the room and may not identify as both. And so when we think about LGBTQ history, I think something that, is important to mention is that LGBTQ people have been here since the dawn of time. There may not be as much documentation of LGBTQ folks because of the ways that transphobia, heterosexism may have either erased people's stories or the fact that most people prior to the last 50 years lived in the closet out of fear of violence and perhaps even being killed. But from some of the few traces of LGBTQ history and as well as the interpretations of history that is in front of our faces, we've been able to deduce that there have been LGBTQ people who have existed in every major civilization for thousands of years. For example, on the left are examples of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. In the middle is an interpretation of the Babaylan from the Philippines. On the right is a picture of Wei Wa, who was a Native American civil rights activist. And then the bottom two are depictions from the Bible, that even in the Bible themselves, there are stories that can be interpreted as queer. One is the story of Ruth and Naomi, and the other story of Jonathan and David. What's interesting about the Bible is the Bible is often used against LGBTQ folks. But if we read into some of the stories through a queer lens, we'll see that there were even queer people in the Bible itself. When I think about LGBTQ history, I think about the ways in which LGBTQ people had to put their lives on the line in order to have the freedoms that we all have today. That to be out meant potentially losing your job, losing your family, and maybe even death. And so when the Stonewall uprisings happened in 1969, and prior to that, the uprisings in San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago, we need to understand the context in which that happened, that those folks who protested against the police, who claimed that they deserved to not be treated with violence, harassment, or disrespect, that they put their lives on the line for all of us. And that while this is something that 50 years later, people may not necessarily think about, or that even there is this notion that pride has become more corporate or has lost some of its original activist origins, I think it's important for us to do our own self-reflection on ways that we also need to teach others about these histories, that it isn't just about rainbows, but it's also about fighting against police violence, fighting against systemic oppression, and honoring those who've come before us. When I think about LGBTQ history, I think about the different moments in time in which LGBTQ people have fought for our rights, not just at those earlier stages of the Stonewall uprisings, but even in the 1980s and 90s with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and the ways in which LGBTQ people were fighting for people to recognize that we existed, as well as fighting for people to recognize that we deserve to live. And so when we think about LGBTQ rights, one of the things that's important and something that many other historically marginalized groups will recognize as well is that they're never given to us, that they're things that people have to fight for. That unless people of those marginalized communities fight up against the systems that oppress them, that people will not have some of the rights and privileges that they have today. When I think about LGBTQ history, I think about how far we've come. These are samplings of things that you may have seen on TV in the 1990s that were considered groundbreaking at the time because they demonstrated to the world that gay and lesbian people existed, and perhaps even exposed people to people and concepts that they were not familiar with. Another thing that it did was perhaps allowed for LGBTQ people who were in the closet to feel more comfortable in coming out because they saw people in not only in the media who may identify as they do, but also that perhaps people were becoming more vocally accepting of LGBTQ people. However, if you look at some of these images, you'll notice that most of the images of LGBTQ people from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s were of LGBTQ white people, and that was the story that was being centered when we talked about LGBTQ rights. And that perhaps the stories of LGBTQ people of color were either being erased or told incorrectly or told in stereotypical ways, which then may have a different effect of how LGBTQ people of color may be able to navigate through society. And so these are some of the images of LGBTQ people of color that we saw over the past 30 years, from RuPaul and her first beginnings in the public sphere in the 90s, to Pedro from The Real World, to the television show Noah's Ark, to Queen Latifah's character in Set It Off. And in more recent years, we see even more visibility of LGBTQ people telling their own stories from their own lenses, such as the television show Pose, some of the cast members of RuPaul's Drag Race. Here are two Filipinas, Manila Luzon and Chicli Caliente, and then even more recently with movies like Fire Island. So, and acknowledging that the LGBTQ movement is one that has existed over the past 50 years at least, and acknowledging that there have been many, there has been much movement for LGBTQ rights, beginning in 2014, 2015, when we started to see some of the rights for same-sex marriage on both state and federal levels, with 2015 being when the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage or same-sex marriage. We've seen more visibility of LGBTQ people in the media, in government, and in across all sectors. But I think it's also important to recognize that there is still so much work to be done. There is still anti-LGBTQ hate violence that's very real for communities all across the country. While we know that that people like Harvey Milk and Matthew Shepard exist, or that they were killed through heinous methods because of their sexual orientation identities, they are often the faces of what people think about when they think about anti-gay hate crimes in the US. And their stories are often told more than stories of people like Sakia Gunn, who was murdered in New Jersey. Sakia was a Black lesbian teenager. Some say that she, in today's terms, would identify as genderqueer or gender non-binary. And she died just a few years after Matthew Shepard. There's also Stephen Lopez Mercado, who in 2010 was dismembered as a result of a hate crime in Puerto Rico. There's Elon Nettles, who was killed in New York City in 2014. And Jennifer Loud, who was a trans Filipina, who was killed in the Philippines by a US military personnel. And so these are some of the stories that don't get told at all, or we hear about stories that attempt to whitewash the intersectionalities of LGBTQ people of color. So for example, the Orlando Pulse Massacre, which occurred in 2016, took the lives of 49 LGBTQ folks, mostly Latinx and all people of color, self-identified people of color. But when the news media reported on them, they referred to it as simply an LGBTQ hate crime and not one that involved their race. We also think about the murderers of trans people, especially transgender women and especially Black transgender women in the United States. Every year, there is a growing number of women who are murdered in the US. Last year, I believe the number was 38 trans people who were murdered in the US, with majority of them being Black transgender women. And so these are conversations that we need to continue to have that oftentimes aren't being reported by the media. So just a few facts about LGBTQ people and hate violence. Most LGBTQ hate crimes still go unreported, are misclassified, or are not publicized by the media. So for every LGBTQ hate crime that you hear of, to know that there are many more that weren't reported at all. And there are many reasons why. Some LGBTQ people won't report hate crimes because of a mistrust of the police, or because police may not label them as hate violence, or because they fear retaliation, that perhaps if they report this, that more violence will occur. In 2020, there were 1,297 anti-LGBTQ hate crime incidents in the US. They comprise of 19% of all hate crimes, and this was documented by the FBI. And the Hate Crimes Act now requires agencies to include sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes. And this is a result of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Act of 2009, which President Obama signed when he first took office. Some other facts about LGBTQ people and hate violence: gay white men are most likely to report hate crimes. However, LGBTQ people of color, especially Black transgender women, experience hate crimes at significantly higher rates proportionate to their overall population. A study by the National Council of Transgender Equity found that half of trans people in their 215 study reported being verbally harassed in the past year. And so that means that essentially, if you're transgender, you have a 50% chance that you will be harassed sometime in the year. And that's something that is a daily experience for trans people, especially trans people of color. So I'm going to switch over to talking a little bit about Asian American and Pacific Islander history. This is a photo of San Malo, which is the earliest settlement of Asian Americans in the United States. These are Filipino men who escaped Spanish galleon ships and first arrived in the United States as early as the 1700s. 1763 is the recorded date. And they formed these villages in Louisiana. One of the things that's important for me to acknowledge is that when we think about Asian American history, oftentimes this history is erased. People start Asian American history by starting with the Chinese railroad workers who came in the 1800s and erase the Filipinos that came prior to them. And so this becomes a challenge in Asian American history, is that who's considered Asian, who has a voice, who continues to be erased, and for what reasons. And so this is just something to start off with as I talk about this very diverse group, which we label under this umbrella of Asian American Pacific Islander. So let's break it down. Asian American and Pacific Islander comprises of two entities, all that are supposedly lumped under this larger term of AAPI. So the term Asian American refers to a person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including over 40 distinct ethnicities. And this is a census definition. And so I put a few pictures of my friends of different ethnicities just to signify that these are folks who might not look anything like each other, but yet we are all under this category of Asian American. And so when we think about race, it's important to understand that race is a social construct in which people may be classified a certain way based on their skin color, hair texture, or facial features, but that many people of the same racial group will not have the same skin color, hair texture, or facial features. Who are the Native Hawaiians and the Pacific Islanders? Well, the term Pacific Islander consists of 17 distinct ethnic groups in the United States. Similarly, different histories, different phenotypes, different histories of colonization. Some Pacific Islanders have never stepped foot on mainland United States. Others have migrated to mainland US, yet all under this umbrella of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So I want to just recognize the heterogeneity of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. In total, there are 50 or 60 ethnicities within the two main categories. There's an array of phenotypes and racialized experiences. Phenotypes are the ways in which you look, and as a result of that, the ways that people may treat you racially. There are hundreds of religions and spiritual practices, multiple generations in the US, various immigration experiences. Some people come as refugees. Some came as a result of that Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 as professionals, others who come as migrant workers, as undocumented immigrants, and so forth. There's a spectrum of gender identities, and sexual orientations within each group, social class and education diversity. While many Asian Americans are labeled as the model minority, there are also many Asian American groups that have the highest rates of high school dropouts, the lowest rates of college graduation, and also the highest rates of poverty in comparison to any racial ethnic group. Asian Americans have also used unique experiences of colonialism, particularly in relation to the United States, and that's something I'm going to talk about on this slide. So when we think about Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, it's important to understand the AAPI history consists of both migration and colonialism. And what that means is that while many people may have migrated to the United States in search of a better life, that this may have been influenced by this notion of colonialism, and this sense that the United States set forth to colonize the entire world, or at least have a presence across the entire globe. In 1898, we know that the United States annexed the Philippines, Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and attempts to also to annex Guam, Samoa, and other parts of the Pacific Islands. And so when we think about this history, to know that there isn't one Asian American story or one AAPI story, but rather that there would be hundreds, thousands of Asian American and Pacific Islander stories. As I mentioned before, some Pacific Islanders have never set forth on US land, but yet they may have more American experiences because their lands of origin may have been colonized by the US. And so this is something that's important for us to acknowledge, even for countries that were not officially colonized by the US, that the influence of American imperialism may have been a reason why they came to this country, that there may have been opportunities that they thought they would be able to find here in the US, only to be met with systemic racism, violence, and other things. The photo on the left is a photo of Angel Island, in which many East Asian Americans and Filipino Americans the port in which they came through when they first migrated to the US. A photo on the right is is an example of one of the many political cartoons that symbolized what it was like when the United States took over these various countries. And as you can see, the United States is depicted as an older, wise man with his wife on the side, and that these smaller countries are viewed as children who they are attempting to civilize. So with the Asian American Pacific Islander movement, it's really important to acknowledge that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were terms that were not created until much later, until the 1960s, when people of different ethnic groups decided that perhaps we need to work together as a united front in order to tackle systemic oppression. And so the term Asian American came out of talks in the 1960s and 70s, starting with student movements in the West Coast, particularly in California. And then the lumping of Asian American and Pacific Islander happened in the 1980s, in which the census really combine both of the groups together. And so really just understanding that the reason why this is even an umbrella group is something that either one came out of people's needs to unite with others, to perhaps gain more power in numbers, but also that there is a government sanction in which people were lumped together for the sake of convenience. I want to share a little bit about some historical context of hate violence and overt racism, and to talk about how that has been integral to U.S. history. What they don't teach us in a lot of American history books is that there has been dozens of acts of violence towards AAPIs throughout the history of the U.S. Many people are trying to erase that history and to try to make people think that it's all been pleasantries between Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and the U.S., but really their relationships have been tense, or there have been histories of violence for decades. So for example, in 1871, there was a Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, in which 1/10 of the Asian American population, or the Chinese American population, was massacred or was murdered by white nationalists who thought that Chinese people were destroying their society. The Page Act of 1875, the Asian Exclusion Act of 1882, and later 1924 prevented Asian people from coming to this country. The Page Act is something that people may not be aware of, but it explicitly prevented Chinese American women from coming to the US because they were perceived as being sex workers, as being immoral, and perhaps demoralizing men in the United States, especially on the West Coast. I mentioned before US imperialism of the Philippines, Hawaii, Samoa, and others. But there were also many anti-Asian riots that occurred. The Bellingham riots of 1907 in Washington was riots that targeted South Asians. The Watsonville riots of 1930 in California targeted Filipino Americans. Many people may be familiar with Japanese internment, in which thousands of Japanese Americans were put into internment camps because they were to not be trusted during World War II. Many who lost millions of dollars in total because of the ways in which their homes and their occupations were taken from them. And then we also know that there was post 9/11 Islamophobia, post 2016 Islamophobia and xenophobia, which I'll talk about in more detail in a little bit. And then currently there are issues related to the struggles for indigenous land, for example, in the Hawaiian Kingdom and Mauna Kea, and some of the racialized aspects of the current COVID pandemic. Okay, I'm going to get through all this. All right, so one of the things that I have to mention is that when we think about Asian Americans, because oftentimes we think about East Asians or Chinese and Japanese and Korean Americans as being Asian, or the face of what Asian American means, people may not realize that anti-Asian violence has occurred prior to the COVID pandemic. In fact, after 9/11 and even after the 2016 elections, we saw that there were many South Asians or Muslims Muslims or people who are perceived to be Muslims who were murdered as a result of hate violence. So Balbir Singh Sodhi in 2001, just days after 9/11, Adel Karas was an Egyptian American man who was killed shortly after 9/11. And in 2017, Srinivas Kochibotla was murdered in Kansas shortly after the 2016 election. And so these are instances of anti-Asian violence. And then we know that in 2020, 2021, and 2022, that there were several instances of anti-Asian violence that occurred. And so understanding that this isn't new, this is something that has occurred throughout history. Just some fun, like not fun facts, but facts from Stop AAPI Hate, which is an organization that has attempted to document Asian hate in the past few years. The most common forms of anti-Asian hate violence is verbal harassment at 63%, followed by physical assault, deliberate avoidance, civil rights violations, and online harassment. 61.8% of all hate incidents are reported by women, and that Chinese Americans report the most hate incidents according to this report. But what's interesting is that prior reports from before the pandemic, the largest number of people experiencing hate violence were South Asians and Filipino Americans. And so this is important to acknowledge because perhaps Asian Americans are always susceptible to hate violence, but perhaps there might be different groups that are targeted as a result of different things happening in the world. So for example, South Asians may be targeted more often because of 9/11 and Islamophobia that existed. Perhaps Filipino Americans had higher rates at certain points because maybe they are racialized in a different way and experience some of that violence as a result of that. I want to just acknowledge historical trauma and collective trauma. Historical trauma is a complex and collective psychological distress that is experienced over time and across generations of a group of people who share an identity, affiliation, or circumstance. And a collective trauma is a group shared sense of psychological distress as a result of witnessing or observing a terrifying event or tragedy. Historical trauma for Asian Americans and LGBTQ folks has to do with this notion that over time, because of the histories that our communities may have experienced, that we may carry some of the trauma of knowing some of the things that have happened in the past. There's been research on epigenetics, which find that certain groups that may carry trauma in their blood. For example, some of the research is finding that Jewish people who have ties to the Holocaust or African Americans who are descendants of slavery, that they may carry with them certain genetics that may be passed on from generations. Collective trauma is when we experience trauma in the present. So for example, when you are a Black transgender person and you hear of a transgender woman of color getting killed, that might cause you to have some of these trauma reactions, these psychological stressors that may impact your livelihood. And so even though you might not know who these people are, that it might affect how you are able to navigate the world. Sometimes when some of these acts of violence occur, some people have difficulty getting out of bed, some people have difficulty functioning, and even if you didn't know anyone, that it's something that may have a profound effect on you. So I want to briefly share a little bit about LGBTQI in AAPI history, the intersections of the two. This photo right here is from the National March on Washington, D.C. for lesbian gay rights in 1987. And there was an Asian American contingent there. And that's something that many people may not be aware of. In fact, there are many instances in which LGBTQ Asian Americans have contributed significantly to both LGBTQ plus and AAPI history. For example, the Daughters of Bilitis is the oldest lesbian organization in the United States. And the idea of it was brought up by a Filipina named Rosemary Bamberger, a Filipina multiracial woman, that she was the one who initiated that perhaps we need to have a lesbian organization. However, she's oftentimes not credited for the organization because she left due to politics, many that were said to be due to some of the racism she experienced within the organization. Richard Adams and Tom Sullivan were among the first same-sex couples to get married. They were based in California. They went to Colorado because for a brief moment in the 1970s, there was a clerk who was allowing same-sex couples to get married. Richard Adams was Filipino-American. Again, oftentimes we don't hear about this story. I mentioned the contingent on the March on Washington for Lesbian Gay Rights in 1987, as well as the fact that APIs were at the forefront of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and 90s. Many organizations were founded in metropolitan areas such as San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York by Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who recognized that they were not being served for HIV and AIDS, or that there wasn't being research done on them, or that they weren't receiving proper services. And so some of them created organizations to provide some of these services for them. Throughout the history of LGBTQ movement in the United States, there have been many Asian American Pacific Islanders who have been instrumental to the movement. These are just samplings. There's Kumu Hina Wangkalu, trans Native Hawaiian Kumu, or a teacher. There's Cecilia Chung, a trans Chinese American HIV/AIDS activist. Urvashi Vaid, a lesbian Indian American attorney and LGBT community organizer. Many people maybe know George Takei, a gay Japanese American actor and activist, and Gina Rosero, a trans Filipina model, producer, and activist. These are just a sampling of folks, but I encourage folks to continue to look for some of the LGBTQ Asian American Pacific Islanders who have been instrumental in advocating for LGBTQ rights and Asian American rights within their own communities, within the general Asian American community, and within general society. In terms of research, there's been some scholarship that has found that LGBTQ people of color have higher prevalence of substance abuse, HIV/AIDS, mental health issues, suicidal ideation, general health disparities, psychiatric symptoms, victimization, harassment, and exposure to the criminal justice system. But for Asian Americans in general, some of the research, which is still very limited, describes some common experience such as race-related dating and relationship problems, oftentimes being exoticized within the relationships, notions of internalized heterosexism or transphobia, bullying and workplace discrimination, outness to family, psychological distress, and microaggressions, which I'll talk about in a bit. Some cultural considerations are that gender and sexuality in pre-colonial Asian countries were a lot more fluid. So it wasn't until Western colonization came that some of these Asian countries became more homophobic or transphobic, that there are existences across many Asian countries and Pacific Islander nations of two-spirited people or people who were considered gender fluid. So for example, in Thailand, there's a notion of the katoi. In the Philippines, there's the notion of the babaylan. And so it wasn't until Western colonization came that some of these groups became more homophobic or transphobic. Another thing that has come up in my research and in other people's research is this notion that coming out is an American or Western concept. The idea of sitting your parents down, your family down and saying, I'm gay, I'm trans, is something that is said to be something that's very American, that many people don't have to do it in Asian countries or Pacific Islander communities. And that is the power of the unspoken and the spoken, that perhaps certain things can be left unsaid because of the cultural tradition that are attached to those things, and that people can still feel supported by folks without having to officially come out to them. This is something that I developed. It's an intersectional identity development model, which basically describes the many ways in which LGBTQ plus Asian Americans may identify based on their racial identity, their ethnic identity, and their sexual identity. And so, for example, some people who are Asian American may have a strong sense of being Asian American and a strong sense of their ethnic identity, for example, being Filipino American or South Asian American, but have a low identity or identification with their sexuality, being gay or lesbian or queer, being they might be closeted or may have a lot of shame. And so it's important to understand that many people will have different statuses and may navigate the world differently based on some of their experiences, that not everyone will be fully integrated into their identities. And this is why we have to do everything we can to support them. My work has focused a lot on microaggressions, and I just wanted to share some of the common LGBTQ API microaggressions that people may experience. And so this is an example of a Filipina queer woman who says that she enters family functions and people say, "Why are you not married yet? Where's your boyfriend?" So this is a common LGBTQI microaggression. Microaggressions are defined as brief, commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, environmental indignities. I'm going to just go through some of the racial microaggressions first. Microaggressions related to the ascription of intelligence. People presume Asian Americans to be model minorities. Alien in one's own land. People presume Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to be perpetual foreigners. The photo on the right or on the left says, so like, what are you? People feel that they could just ask you questions like that when they don't know what you are, your ethnicity is. Types of anti-LGBTQ microaggressions, there's heterosexist and transphobic language, the assumption of pathology, exoticization or tokenism is something that's common. And so this photo on the left is a queer Filipino man who says that people say, "This is my gay best friend," exoticizing or tokenizing him for being gay. Intersectional microaggressions are this notion that people may possess an array of social identities that affect their experiences, and that people may experience microaggressions as a result of two or more of their social identities. And so people might view you as, or because of your race and gender and sexual orientation, people might exclude you differently, might make presumptions about you because of your identities. And so just understanding that intersectionalities matter. Some common intersectional microaggressions that may occur are exclusion within LGBT communities in general, exclusion within communities of color, or the denial of LGBTQ existence in communities of color. So when people, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, if their families may say things to them like, "That doesn't exist in our community, that's a white thing." So denying that LGBTQ people have been in our communities since the dawn of time. So this is just what happens if I experience a microaggression. And if you do, there's a process that tends to happen. I'm going to just skim through this because I know we're out of time. But did that really just happen? Was race, gender, sexual orientation, ability evolved? Should I react? If I react, what are the consequences? If I don't react, what are the consequences? I share this model just to demonstrate that there is no real right or wrong way. And oftentimes people may not know what to do, but to also validate that this is a very common process that happens to people when they experience microaggressions. What happens if I experience or witness microaggressions? In the moment, you might say something like, "What do you mean by that?" You might use I statements, share like, "When you did that, it made me feel this way." If you have privilege or power and you witnessed someone else experiencing microaggression, it might be something that you might want to consider doing. You might use humor if appropriate. And then later, it might be something might be worthwhile is finding allies or support if you don't feel like you can confront someone in the moment, confront or challenge someone in private, or send an email or communicate in some other way if you don't feel comfortable confronting a person in the moment. And if you commit a microaggression and somebody points that out to you, you may want to manage your defensiveness, validate that person's experience, apologize, which is something that people don't tend to do, commit to learning to change, and then later finding your allies and support and making amends. So the last thing I want to end with is just this notion of accomplices, people who use their privileged identities to advocate for people who are targeted by microaggressions, especially through challenging systems and institutions, so that historically marginalized groups don't feel they must always fight for themselves. And upstanders are a similar concept, and they're people who take action while witnessing injustice instead of participating as bystanders. It's so hard oftentimes for people of historically marginalized groups to stand up for justice themselves because they may fear further injustice, they may fear further retaliation, they may fear further violence. And so if you're somebody who does identify with a privileged group, that maybe it would be important to be an accomplice or an upstander, to use your privileged identity to communicate to someone else that what they're doing is considered bias or unjust, or showing some of your support or affirmation for people who experience some of this violence. Sometimes it's easier for people people with power and privilege to stand up against violence because they have less to lose. They may not fear retaliation in the same way that somebody who has historically marginalized identities. They may not fear being excluded or being shunned as a result of standing up for justice. And so this is something that could be especially effective for people who have power and privilege. And then finally, just some reflections and revolutions. These are just some things to consider as you go out into your world, whether it be in your workplace environment or in your families and communities. Review and reflect all policies and procedures, questioning who is being centered and served. Most systems reflect people with power and privilege. They center people who are cisgender, people who are heterosexual, people who are white, people who are American, people who are educated, and so forth. Thinking about something as simple as like, what holidays do we celebrate and which holidays are not considered excusable in terms of absences from work or from school. Thinking about who is centered when policies are considered or consider things like families and child leave and things like that. Do queer people who have families have those same opportunities? Disrupt and challenge the status quo, especially regarding how equity issues are addressed. Thinking about ways in which we must always try to fight against what's considered normal, because who is that based on? And again, maybe that was centered on other privileged communities. And then finally, in your own workplace, create a culture in which people feel seen, heard, understood, and included. And that might be ways like normalizing the use of sharing people's pronouns, or celebrating pride, or finding ways for people to feel comfortable in being themselves. Right? In the workplace, a lot of times LGBTQ people don't feel comfortable in having water cooler conversations because they don't know that it's okay for them to talk about what they did over the weekend. And so creating spaces in which people can share about their families, their interests, their activities, where they don't feel judged or they don't feel like they'll be excluded, is something that I hope everyone can consider doing as we celebrate not just Pride, but API heritage. And my final thought is, this is a photo from a youth summit at the White House of LGBTQ plus Asian Americans Pacific Islanders in 2011, is to think about the future. You know, there are more and more people are identifying as LGBTQ plus. I think the most recent data is finding that up to 10 to 20% of young people identify on the spectrum of queerness or transness. And so the future is becoming more and more diverse. And so what are we going to do to catch up to that? What are we going to do to ensure that queer and trans people, especially within our own families and communities, are accepted, are celebrated? And what kind of world can we possibly live in if young people don't have to worry about being rejected from their families or kicked out of their homes from their families, in which they don't have to worry about internalized homophobia or internalized transphobia, where they could just live like everyone else and have the same types of problems and anxieties as everyone else that doesn't have that additional nuance of oppression. And if we all can do our parts to ensure that every young person feels validated, seen, understood, normalized, then perhaps we're all doing our parts to make the world a better and more prouder place to live for everyone. So that's it for me now. Thank you so much for listening. Feel free to follow me on social media. And thank you everyone so much. Happy Pride and happy belated Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Heritage Month.
Thank you so much, Kevin, just for your wisdom, your presence. Definitely going to be coming back to this recording, and just also for posing in those last couple minutes ways that we can be in solidarity and really move forward collectively. So again, just want to invite folks that are able to join us for our Q&A. That's going to be from 1 to 1:30, and that's going to be in a separate space. So we're going to go ahead and close this webinar. Thank you all so much. This recording will be available on the Office of Diversity and Outreach's YouTube in a couple weeks. So we just ask for your patience, and thank you so much for joining, and see those that will be joining us in the Q&A soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.